In an interview a number of years ago, Bruce Michelson described himself this way. I'm an English professor who believes too much in teaching and perhaps too little in what passes for research in certain humanities subdisciplines. Saying important, complex things in plain language about literature and culture is a purpose that runs through the things that I've written. Amen. Two things come to mind when I think of Bruce. First, an impressively serious thinker who is deeply and genuinely excited by ideas. And second, an animated writer who takes great care in crafting sentences that say really meaningful things. Ham Hill once famously took the field of Twain studies to task, where he considered to be its foolish, often self-promoting scholarship and bloodless prose in which it was routinely written. As one colleague recently put it, Hill's appeal was for work that better measured and measured up to Mark Twain, to his scope, his talent, his humanity. Nobody, to my mind, embodies those things Hill called for better than Bruce. Innovative perspective, taking familiar, mostly worn conversations in brand new directions. And perspectives always that are presented in language that lives and breathes. These qualities are not accidents. Habits of the mind shape the patterns of our work and our daily lives. And Bruce's interests beyond Twain have borne particular witness to his passion for ideas and language. His earliest research took up the work of poet and translator Richard Wilbur. His most recent project is a translation from the French of Georges Clemenceau's memoir of longtime friend Claude Monet. Most of us here know Bruce, though, best through his work on Twain humor studies. His Mark Twain on the Loose 1995, Literary Wit 2001, and Printer's Devil Mark Twain and the American Publishing Revolution 2006 are each important books. But together, I think they easily represent one of the two or three most significant contributions to contemporary Mark Twain studies. I suspect, too, that Ham Hill, had he lived long enough to see all three in print, would have recognized in Bruce's work, whether intended or not, a worthy rejoinder. Ben and I couldn't be happier, more grateful that Bruce agreed to take on the keynote for the symposium on Mark Twain in the West. So please help me welcome Bruce Michelson.
Wow, thanks. I got bawled out, though, at dinner because I don't have a title for this. I'm just calling it Keynote, and we've got to mug one up. Let's disruptive thoughts about this conference. We'll start with that as a working idea, and you guys can. It has a discernible point, I think, and we maybe come up with something better when we get to the end of it. It's 20 minutes long, so you're not stuck. Before we get going, though, I want to suggest that at your own time and pace over the weekends, at some point, think seriously about Hal Bush. We lost a few weeks ago after a catastrophic accident. He was a wonderful scholar, brilliant teacher, and a tremendously important colleague and friend. We lost him way too young. And so, if you knew him, count yourself lucky to have been on the planet with him and been in his company. Okay, a sesquicentennial, as a way to affirm the importance of something that happened a long time ago, must be also, and especially for people like us in the literature and culture trades, another excursion into paradox. For at the core of our conversations this weekend, we're addressing Roughing It from two perspectives which are inevitably in a measure of conflict. First, there will be heightened attention tomorrow to the matter of what this text originally was. In other words, what it signified and reflected around 1871, the specific historical and cultural moment in which it was completed and published simultaneously from 7 cities across the U.S., as well as in London. And second, we'll negotiate other questions, more diffuse, but also important, about what this book is, or can be for us now, amid our 20th century predicaments, how Roughing It might be read to foreshadow or illuminate or disrupt perceptions and discontents that hold our attention elsewhere in contemporary life. Roughing It then as a cultural artifact, and possibly as a still influential and relevant cultural text. What we can engage tomorrow, along the way, and then after the smoke of the day is cleared, is how these two contemplations might conjoin for us in reading the book, teaching it, and having fun. So what I can offer here as a pregame entertainment is first a few thoughts about technological and cultural circumstances from the year 1871, or very near to it. Developments which seem to subtend and support some of the insights in this strong set of papers, perhaps broaden their implications and suggest relationships among the whole set. I'll close with a couple of speculations about those connections. This won't take long. Developments I have in mind from around 1871 can be summarized like this. First, the facilitation and rise of what could be called a plein air engagement with both the natural landscape and the human presence within it. I'm suggesting a specific set of circumstances and incentives which, to pirate a phrase from Robert Frost, conspired to drive the poet out of door, propelling artists and writers into better, more immediate, more spontaneous, and more improv relationships with their subject, and also intensifying a taste among consumers of these arts for this feeling of dynamism, vigor, and candor in what they were vicariously experiencing now in the city galleries or on the printed page. In memorable work dating from around the year 1870, we can see a dramatic conflict between, on one hand, these new and industrially empowered ways of negotiating life beyond the study, the studio, or even the city limits, and on the other hand, traditional modes of representation familiar to audiences in Europe and America. Second, I want to note a couple of less notorious effects of the advent of steam and lightning. In other words, the headlong ascendancy of railroads and telegraph systems upon these Wild West landscapes and human settlements in the most famous and imaginatively influential chapters of Roughing It, and also on countless other places in the Old World as well as in North America, places that had also been remote and rustic until recently. 2 years before Mark Twain finished his book, the first American transcontinental rail line, as a massive, fractious collaboration between the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific companies, with support and coercion from the federal government, had pulled rough and tumble Virginia City, Nevada through a metaphysical barrier by running track through that stretched more or less smoothly and seamlessly all the way to Chicago, New York, and the shores of San Francisco Bay. And a spur from that line was also operational through the high desert to Gold Hill and Carson City. Bulky, powerful apparatus, Eastern consumer goods and amusements, and more greenhorns than ever could sluice in now from thousands of miles off, with consequences that have been summarized in many historical surveys. But amid all that steam and frenzy, it's easy to miss certain imaginative challenges that these new systems could pose for the traveler, and especially for the travel writer, who wanted to witness and chronicle things as they really are. For not only did sectors of the American West begin a process of domestication, expanding out from these new depots and other comforts and safeguards, in the Old World as well, where Sam's adventures and impressions had made him famous with The Innocents Abroad in 1869, a transfiguration of ancient famous places now blessed or cursed with railroad connections was disruptively underway, bringing not a loss of wildness so much as of authenticity, a ramifying sensory and cognitive confusion involving replication, restoration, and outright counterfeit. To try to summarize these dilemmas of seeing around the year 1870, when the places one seeks to represent, or is compelled professionally to describe, either accurately or with artistic license, are themselves works in progress, places undergoing a rapid and fundamental change in fabric and character, places where the old and the new, and sometimes the contrived old as well, all compete for your attention. And all of this underway when the legendary, the sensational, and the picturesque are what your intended audiences have conditioned to prefer. With all that going on, the writer and the artist can face new green thickets of challenge and choice in the art and craft of representation. Our set of conference papers taken together explores the truth that in Roughing It, seeing and conveying the truth of the West was no easy business. That at times Mark Twain's narrative strategies resonate uncannily with experimentation in the fine arts at that same moment, and that in other places in the book, Mark Twain tways to established American and European romantic and mass culture tastes and fantasies of a Wild West that was rapidly fading away in the Washoe territory, or even already gone. To start with the apparatus and consequences of plein air engagement in the years we're looking at, and the consequent rift between older and newer strategies of representing the world far from home. In 1867, when Mark Twain was on his Quaker City adventures in Europe and the Holy Land, Albert Bierstadt's giant painting, The Domes of the Yosemite, was on traveling exhibition through cities on the American East Coast, while Frederick Church's magisterial Niagara Falls from the American side, now in the Scottish National Gallery in Edinburgh, was also making the rounds of public galleries and attracting admission-paying payers in admiration. 8 feet wide and 7.5 feet high, Church's canvas has nothing on Bierstadt's, which measures 15 feet by 10. Bierstadt's most famous work, The Rocky Mountains, Lander's Peak, completed in 1863, is also a monster, 10 feet by 6, and now takes up an entire wall at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The point is simply that in their dimensions, these paintings, as stunning artifacts from the movement called Luminism, a descendant of the American Hudson River School, and back farther, the grand scale romantic painting in England and France, proclaim in no uncertain terms their creation indoors, their laborious construction in well-equipped ateliers far from the represented natural settings. There's no way to imagine either of these artists working on such a scale out among the deer and the antelope and the treacherous weather. Oil paints packed into metal tubes, commonly cited as the critical breakthrough that made plein air painting an Impressionist revolution possible, were an innovation dating from the 1840s, to be sure. But what Bierstadt and Church and many other more or less traditional landscape artists in England and America were still doing around 1870 had nothing to do with technological backwardness. They were affirming instead a way of seeing that valorized recollection and reconstruction in tranquility, a kind of seeing that intended a representation of a timeless sublime, the natural wonder imagined as somehow impervious to the human presence and supremely indifferent to it. Church's sequence of Niagara Falls paintings have no people in them at all, though tourists have been flocking to those same vantage points for generations. And while Bierstadt's panorama of the Rocky Mountains includes a small group of nomadic Indians and their horses in the middle distance, they seem only incidental to the mountain majesty that looms over them. They're small and they blend into the color palette of the valley. In Bierstadt's array of Yosemite Valley paintings from the middle 60s and after, we see a few tiny figures providing scale, a couple of elk, a few cattle, a handful of little people on horseback, but in many of these grandiose works, there's nobody home. In 1870, however, a coterie of younger painters, including Claude Monet and Pierre-Auguste Renoir, were packing up their kits and hauling them out to Normandy beaches, to farm fields, and leisure spots along the Seine, natural settings that were usually replete with ordinary people going about their business or leisure, and in these early Impressionist landscapes, these people matter. In Monet's canvases showing a place on the Seine called La Grenadière, basically a pleasure spot called the translation is the Frog Pond, most of them dating from 1870 or 71, we see bathers, boaters, cafe layabouts, not in the background, but right up front. When several in this pack of Impressionists descended on the river village of Argenteuil in 1870, they painted the landscape and the locals and each other in the mix. Monet did, for example, a self-promotion canvas of the little studio boat he had knocked together so he could work on location. It's untrue that these Impressionist painters did everything outdoors. Monet's culminating masterpieces, for example, the enormous celebrations of sunlight upon his water lily gardens at Giverny, were made possible by an immense studio custom built for that purpose. And for decades before, he and his colleagues had been completing their work in comfortable, civilized rooms. The point here is that when these artists packed wheelbarrows and little boats and went out in search of the world as it is, what they sought to capture and represent was something fleeting, a specific time of day, a play of morning or afternoon light, a momentary pattern of sun, cloud, shadow, and also a human presence and interaction that would also never come again in quite the same way. There are people conspicuous, not incidental, in Monet's landscape paintings from around 1870, and also in plein air work by Renoir, Morisot, Sisley, and Pizarro, and they enhance this powerful theme that this thing we're looking at is a fleeting moment in time, not a breakthrough into a serene and eternal sublime. All right, why could this fine art schism from 1870 have any relevance here? Some possibilities. Blake Bronson Bartlett and Matt Sebo will focus tomorrow on consequences related to changes in the production and transport of words on paper, how inscription was impacted in Mark Twain's West, and also how written and printed discourse was flooding in from far away to conquer and organize the American frontier, to monetize it, and to transform it headlong. Bartlett describes how mass-produced graphite pencils and cheap portable notebooks providing Sam with the wherewithal to record and create in the midst of his journeys and the thick of the action offered not only professional convenience for the author on the move, but also a heightened capacity to capture and convey change, contingency, the motions of the observing mind in the presence of the new. An abridgment, in other words, of the temporal delay and the imaginative erosion between the moment of the actual encounter and those recollections of tranquility that Wordsworth and Coleridge had valorized, in part because they had to, given the clumsier options available to late district romantics for inscribing their spontaneous overflows of feeling at the opening of the 19th century. Matt Sebold's paper, taking its cue from Mark Twain's account of riding in stagecoaches piled high with sacks of U.S. mail, explores the gossamer network of the postal system as a storm still gathering, poised by 1870 to migrate from horse-drawn wagons to fast-moving 50-foot boxcars, along with the human multitudes barging into the foreground, displacing the timeless and creating the raucous ephemeral. Here too came their unceasing utterance, penciled, ink-penned, printed on a press, and everything in consequence would be changed. Moreover, directly addressing this matter of landscape painting and Mark Twain's verbal efforts to engage with the countryside of the Great Basin, Jeffrey Melton invokes the Hudson River School in ways that exemplify this larger transformation, this acceleration of pace, this revised understanding of natural sites as places of metamorphosis. You might recall that when Alice Walton of the Walmart Waltons purchased the 1849 painting Kindred Spirits by Asher Duran from the New York Historical Society for $35 million in May of 2005, it became overnight the most famous or notorious work associated with the Hudson River School. Showing Thomas Cole and William Cullen Bryant conferring together on a flat rock above a lush Catskill woodland. Your students know this because it's on the cover of one of the Norton anthologies. It also seems a good illustration for Jeffrey's insight. The painting's ostensible subject is once again unspoiled natural beauty, the redemptive wildness of the world, yet the execution of the work is again exquisitely and conspicuously indoor. Not brazenly so with the verbal landscapes of Roughing It. When Mark Twain moves through the backcountry, you can often feel the bounce of the stagecoach, the jostle of horseback. And again, there may be parallels here with what was underway in the French countryside in those same years, this scattered revolution in representing the world outside as a world of action and change. Moreover, in what we'll hear tomorrow from Scott Holmes, James Wharton Leonard, and Jim Caron, Mark Twain's Roughing It accounts are notable only for their emphasis on physical motion, not only for their emphasis on physical motion and displacement, but also for an inner unsettledness, a psychological and moral rootlessness in ways of seeing, a dynamic consciousness reporting and evaluating in constant motion through a dynamic American West. Which brings us to the other matter. A certain Gilded Age, Second Empire, high Victorian, stone brick and mortar complication having to do with representing truth, authenticity. These challenges for the observer related to seeing and describing things as they really are. The railroading of a place, the arrival of iron highways and downtown contorting yards and depots to pull in these throngs of new people and their baggage right into the center of things on a scale unimaginable only a decade or two before. Changes like this also brought an incentive, even an imperative, for destinations to remake themselves into tidied, reconstructive evocations and replicas of what they had never really been, to work up the crumbling castles and the casemates the ancient churches and ruins, and the other quaint, storied, and picturesque fabric that mass tourism now requires. Shore up the chateau and rebuild the belfries, or they'll take their money somewhere else. Across Western Europe in 1870, this kind of facelifting was widespread, and a tally of what was being overhauled or built from scratch with these purposes in mind would consume the rest of the night. In France, scaffoldings and chantiers under the supervision of Viollet-le-Duc were scattered from Carcassonne in the far southwest, up through Chartres and Paris and Reims, and onward to the Belgian border. Still a windowless, unevocative hulk of a prison, Mont-Saint-Michel in 1870 was being surveyed for drastic reconstruction into the medieval wonder, complete with its now iconic retrofitted tower and steeple that would eventually win Henry Adams, who cooed about it with no mention at all of this recent work, a special award from the Society of Architects. In England around 1870, George Gilbert Scott was in the thick of medievalizing that would eventually involve more than 400 churches and nearly every cathedral in the realm, and villages and cities in England and abroad that had lost their old economic reasons for being. Places as small as Chester in England, Avignon in France, and as large as Bruges in Belgium, and Venice, and of course where Venice is, were undertaking massive downtown cleanups and overhauls to become what they are even today. Crowded, lucrative lands that time supposedly forgot. All right, how might this have to do with Mark Twain and Roughing It? First, because this historical and aesthetic restyling of Western Europe was going on full tilt when Sam was doing the tour that led to The Innocents Abroad. This decision or inclination of his to tell the story with special attention to the living, to other travelers on the tour, and to local human beings they encountered in the streets, in the shops, and on and off the prescribed tourist sites. This decision made his first bestseller a standout from countless other travel books, where the fascination remained so centered on genuine or contrived antiquities and the picturesque that they present these places as lifeless. The travel writings of his contemporary Henry James rarely escape from this problem, and one can wander with James in broad daylight through the parks of Paris, the byways of a quaint village, or even the thoroughfares of London without the distraction of encountering anyone else. For Mark Twain and also for William Dean Howells, the human action in the streets of today, places as they teemingly are, takes precedence over looking past all that to daydream of places as they supposedly once were. In one of Howells' more poignant travel sketches from late in his career, he describes the terminal buildings on the quays at Liverpool, the sprawling transport hub where steamships from America would unload thousands of visitors who would then course straight through immigration, baggage claim, and customs to pile immediately onto trains headed for Chester or some other place recommended in their guidebooks as more quaint. The theme of Cowles' sketch is simple. At least glance around you as you move through the present. Bear witness to a great modern city and to the human vitality of the now. It seems to me that Mark Twain's genius as a travel writer encompasses that sentiment. And also that he does involve, and though he does indulge in romantic reveries now and then by night, for example in the aisles of Westminster Abbey and around the hulk of the Schloss at Heidelberg, his daylight adventures are enlivened by companionship, by encounters not with ghosts, but with people. Obviously, these narrative strategies served Mark Twain well when he wrote about his adventures in Washoe and California. But because my own taste went to paradox, I'll complicate this perception and finish up by returning briefly to those problems with authenticity that might be useful in conversations tomorrow. If the Washoe chapters of Roughing It Off of the Wild West is an interlude, before the rail transformed everything and the Sierras went through their amazing transmogrifications at an accelerated pace, the book in its own moment does indulge in excursions away from the truth. And sessions tomorrow will be shedding light on that. Looking into the demographic realities of Virginia City in the 1860s, Carrie Driscoll finds that Mark Twain understated the presence of women and families in the Washoe territory, evidently preferring the comic possibilities and machismo implications of portraying the place as overwhelmingly, desperately, and inaccurately male. Twain used these insights about the liberal theological bent of ministers and preachers in that neighborhood also support an understanding of Washoe as milder and more domesticated than Mark Twain makes it out to be. Scott Holmes reads the book as brimming with fanciful anecdotes and tall tales, and Alex Trimble Young's scrutiny of Mark Twain's attempts at humor at the expense of the Goshen peoples locates the passages in a complex history of attempts to write Native Americans out of history. The essayist and autobiographer Richard Rodriguez likes to say that a modern way to get rid of Indians is to relegate them to the past. The tactic in Bierstadt's Rocky Mountains paintings is to lose them in the spectacular panorama. Mark Twain's gambit in Roughing It is to relegate with ridicule. These observations about outbreaks of untruth in Roughing It can help us understand better how over this long stretch of intervening time, the book that we commonly associate with the moment called American realism has itself become, for good or ill, part of the vast, stubborn mythology of the American West. Perhaps it was inevitable for other reasons as well. A book that connects so strongly with a legend as big as Mark Twain himself will also drift clear on its own energies of historical and cultural truth, becoming part of that trove of Mark Twain literature and lore which other writers even now feel compelled to reckon with. And many books over the past few decades have shown us that Mark Twain's provocative telling can be an incitement for retelling. While these riffs and rejoinders are sometimes no more than opportunistic sequels, we've occasionally been lucky to see better, richer engagements with Mark Twain as a Western writer, a comic writer, a journalist, and an American oracle whose observations, elevated to a kind of wisdom, have been so hard to get rid of. Sherman Alexie, Robert Coover, Fawn Nguyen, Papers for Tomorrow illuminate how each of these authors from our own moment has joined the fray, and how this one old book about the scattering of faraway places and a tumultuous time that came and went almost in a flash can still resonate in our thinking about who and what we are. Thank you.